Probably the most famous boat in American history is the Mayflower. Shown here is one of two replicas that have been built in the last 50 years. Also famous is the place where the Mayflower landed, Plymouth Plantation. Today, Plymouth Plantation is an American living history museum where people live and work and reenact the actual lifestyle of the original Puritan settlers. They bring in grain the old way by drawing it up by hand into sheaves. They cultivate fruit. They cook outside in the same way that the original Pilgrims did. And one can see here a picture of winter life at Plymouth Plantation with the frameworks there of the original shelters that the Pilgrims built before they were able to erect their first houses built with planks and hewn and sawn beams and so on. Welcome to English 3350, a survey of American literature before the Civil War. We're in Studio 3 at the M.D. Anderson Library on the main campus of the University of Houston. I'm Barry Wood, and today we're looking at those first British writers and administrators who came over to the Puritan colonies and left records of their vision of the future country of the United States. The history of English migrations to the Americas is unavoidably a religious history. The writings of those who came were unavoidably religious writings. What little poetry was written in the first century of settlement was unavoidably religious poetry. There was virtually no drama. The Puritans had shut down the theaters in Britain, and the theater was regarded as a corrupt sort of practice, and so we get no live theater in early America, and the novel has not yet emerged. The immigrants saw themselves as a harried and harassed people seeking religious freedom. They thought of their enterprise as a holy enterprise. And in the northern colonies, the people believed that they were founding a holy commonwealth. Now, the migrations of the English to the colonies of New England must be understood in terms of the Reformation. And in addition to that, in England, of course, the very turbulent history of the 16th century, the century immediately preceding these migrations. It all began in 1517 when Martin Luther hammered a document on the church door at Wittenberg in Germany, his famous 95 Theses. These, of course, were critiques of Roman Catholic practices, particularly indulgences. Within a few decades, the reforms that he initiated in protest had led to what we call Protestantism. This is a blanket term, of course, which covers all of the hundreds of denominations in Christianity which are not Roman Catholic. The issues, of course, ran very deeply, but they were very, very central to the Puritans. Now, the first 1,500 years of the Christian era can be, I think, summarized rather briefly for the purpose of looking at the Reformation. Christianity through most of Europe was Roman Catholic. There was the Eastern Orthodox Church far to the east, but its influence was virtually non-existent in Europe. So for simplicity's sake, we can talk about Europe as almost monolithically Roman Catholic. Both the Old Testament and New Testament religion, interestingly enough, had emerged as religions of oppressed peoples. The Hebrews were oppressed by the Egyptians. The Israelites were also oppressed under the Roman Empire when the New Testament emerged. But Christianity became something radically different within 300 years after the time of Jesus. And this crucial event occurred in 313 AD when the Emperor Constantine, the Emperor of Rome, converted to Christianity. And this officially made Christianity the religion of the Roman Empire, which meant all of Europe. The Roman Empire then stretched at one end from England all the way into what is now the Middle East, covering 15 or 20 countries. So officially adopting Christianity made it the officially recognized religion of the major empire of the time. Now, that was in 313 AD. And at that point, Christianity ceased to be a religion of oppressed people, as the Old Testament and New Testament religion had been, and it took on the shape of the monarchy. And Christianity reformulated itself as a Holy Roman Empire that replaced the imperial Roman Empire that was waning away at that time. And the Holy Roman Empire, of course, had its own king at the top, with a residence in the Roman heartland, and a succession from king to prince, except that the succession is not biological. It is now by direct line down the cardinals. Now, this picture remained virtually unchanged then for 1,500 years. The Roman Catholic Church dominated Europe, and indeed no one could even conceive of any other version of Christianity. Of course, there were monasteries where monks gathered for meditation and so on, a kind of mystical strand, but it still fundamentally was Roman Catholic Christianity. Now, one is tempted to say that large institutions with a lot of power easily succumb to abuses of that power, and this is in fact what happened with the Roman Catholic Church. By the 16th century, there were some very severe abuses of power. One was a severe decline in piety. When Martin Luther saw the ritual of the Mass performed 7 times in 1 hour, he regarded that as a liturgical abuse. There was very little piety left in the functioning of Roman Catholic rituals. Secondly, there was a very widespread sale of what are known as indulgences. Officials of the church peddling various things alleged to be the parts of the cloth that wrapped Jesus in the tomb, or parts of the cross, or even fragments of bone. These were clerical abuses, and I dare say if all the bones and pieces of wood and cloth that were sold in the Middle Ages were all gathered together, they would probably fill this studio 3 times over. Thirdly, there was a widespread practice of forgiveness on the part of the clergy. If someone donated to the church, or if someone went through a certain program of penance, these good works were considered to earn their way out of time in purgatory. And low-level officials granted this exemption from years in purgatory. And this is, I suppose, a combination of clerical abuse and theological abuse. In literature, perhaps the best place to look at this kind of thing is in Chaucer's Pardoner's Tale, where it is given very dramatic form. Martin Luther saw very clearly one thing, that the vast hierarchy of the Roman Church stood between the believer and his deity. This was most obvious in the clerical abuse of low-level officials, but it tended to subvert the whole system and remove God from the picture if clerics could grant this sort of thing for people who essentially were paying money and making donations and making the church a very rich institution. Luther had a single answer for this. It's a well-known one. It's the core of his position. It's called justification by faith alone. And basically what that means is that one is not justified, that is, one's relationship is not made just or whole before God by good works. One's situation with God is justified or made whole or put into good order by faith alone. No church official could mediate in this, and certainly no church official could make a decision on this. And with that belief, Luther, in effect, short-circuited the entire institutional church. In his view, if the individual placed his or her faith in God, they were in effect justified, which is to say, brought into a just relationship with the deity. And of course, this meant that God alone could dispense salvation, and the individual who received it was the only one who could know about it, and no amount of good works could earn it. Now, there was a lot more to Luther's position, but this central idea of justification by faith alone becomes central to the Reformation and indeed to the Puritans. What was to be done? Well, there was really no way to get rid of this huge hierarchy, which after all was 15 centuries old. And the only thing to do was to form a new church. And the people who formed new churches regarded themselves as reforming the church, starting all over again back at the Gospels in the primitive situation of primitive Christianity and beginning all over again. And so this era is known as the Reformation. It's a vast time of reforming churches. And within a few decades, a whole succession of Reformed churches came into existence. Now, I think it might be useful to look at the time when all of this is occurring. Here's a timeline running down the center of the chart, and I've put on the left the American settlement dates. New Spain dating, I suppose, from Christopher Columbus. New France dating from Champlain, Jamestown, and Plymouth. And over on the right, events of the European Reformation. Now, it's obvious that Martin Luther coming first in the Reformation affected everyone else in Europe as far as Reformation was concerned. And I've listed John Calvin here, 1536. His monumental book, Institutes of Christian Religion, is what began it all. But there's more than that. There's John Knox, for instance, from Scotland, who worked with Calvin in Geneva and took some of his ideas back, and these eventually filtered into the National Church of Scotland, the Presbyterian Church, and so on. Now, I want to point out here that when New Spain began in 1492, it was before the Reformation. Consequently, the religion that the Spanish brought to the New World was Catholic. And as you know, contemporarily, the Catholic religion dominates in Central America. it still remains the major religion. Similarly, if we come down here to France, well, it would look like France ought to be influenced by the Reformation, but in fact the countries that were most influenced by the Reformation were the northern European countries, Germany, Holland, and Scotland. Principally, there were others, and Switzerland to a certain extent. There was some reform in France, but France and Spain more or less remained Catholic. And so when Champlain came out, immediately following him came the Jesuits, who are really the missionary arm of the Catholic Church, moving into the Huron country in Ontario and spreading Roman Catholic religion there. And French-speaking Quebec, the largest eastern province of Canada today, is still largely a Catholic area. Now, when we come to these two colonies, well, particularly Plymouth, and I suppose we could have added here right after Plymouth, Massachusetts Bay, 1629. When we come to Plymouth and Massachusetts, we have a whole different story. As we know, these were Protestant and militantly Protestant and Puritan. And they came with much stronger ideas about religion than one finds anywhere else in the Protestant world. Well, why is this the case? Well, it has a lot to do with the turbulent history of the monarchy in England. I've indicated at one point here how that figures. In 1533, Henry VIII divorces Catherine of Aragon and marries Anne Boleyn, and that was the touch-off incident. But let us, for a moment, just look at this history a little more in detail. Monarchs of the English Reformation, and I've put quotation marks around the word Reformation because in many ways it was not really a Reformation, only a Reformation in name, but not in substance. The family of Henry VIII and his children is a dysfunctional family. The British monarchy has managed to turn up a good number of dysfunctional groups. It continues in the present day. What's the essence of this? Wife number one, Catherine of Aragon, did not bear Henry a son to take over the throne. And after 20 years of marriage, about 1527, he began to work to get rid of her. It took about 5 years of working to get rid of her. Remember, England at this point is Roman Catholic, and divorce is not allowed by the Roman Catholic Church. So Henry has to seeks a special dispensation. Of course, the Pope doesn't agree to it, and he has to go through a great deal to finally make the break. There's a whole series of acts and so on that are involved. And he then marries, once he gets rid of Catherine of Aragon, he marries Anne Boleyn. Well, she bears a daughter. Actually, Catherine of Aragon bore children. She bore Mary. Anne Boleyn bore a daughter, Elizabeth, and then Henry got rid of her, had her beheaded, and then wife number 3 was Jane Seymour. Finally, Jane Seymour manages to come up with a son, James, and the issue is settled. Of course, Henry went on to have more wives, but that's not part of our essential story here. Well, having gotten rid of the Roman Catholic Church by breaking with it around 1533 in that divorce, Henry then set about to restructure the Roman Catholic Church in England. He took over the cathedrals, just simply seized them, converted them to Church of England, and that's what the word Anglican means, converted them to Church of England, and then began some slight changes in liturgy and catechism and so on, but nothing very earth-shattering. These churches essentially remained the way they had been, medieval cathedrals, but now they were called Church of England rather than Roman Catholic. Well, that really wasn't a Reformation based on doctrinal issues or on any profound spiritual insights. It was simply a matter of convenience for Henry. But it led to some very, very complicated politics. When we look here at when Jane Seymour's son, Edward VI, comes to the throne, he was only 10 years old. He was born in 1537. He was only 10 when he came to the throne, and he died at age 16. So he was basically a puppet. He just did what the wheels were already turning for reform, and he just carried those out. So there was no particular problem there. But when he died, then the daughter, the oldest daughter, the daughter of Henry and his first wife, Catherine, came to the throne in 1553. Now keep in mind that Mary's mother, Catherine, was Catholic. In fact, she was actually the daughter of Ferdinand and Isabel of Spain, so she was Catholic. She had seen her mother divorced by her father. She thought the whole reformation of the church into the Anglican was wrong. And so she set about to reverse the whole process, and violence started to develop in England, and you started to get a tremendous conflict between the Catholics and the Protestants, which lasted for about 5 years. When she died, then Elizabeth I, who was the daughter of wife number 2, Henry and Anne Boleyn, she came to the throne, and of course that's Elizabeth I, for which Elizabethan England is named. She remained on the throne for a very long time, and she saw the wisdom of perhaps remaining neutral, not stirring things up too much. So she tried not to agitate in either way. She didn't try to be pro-Anglican particularly or pro-Catholic. She just really let the matter ride. And what this meant was then that various groups in England who really wanted to see a Reformation, after all, they had the example from Europe, really wanted to see a Reformation, were very, very dissatisfied. And so we get groups springing up in England who really want the Reformation to go ahead. And this is where we get the Puritans. The Puritans arose really as a group who felt that the Anglican Church had not really gone anywhere with its reform, and it was still overlaid with all kinds of what they called popery, elaborate decorations in the church, elaborate ritual, and so on. They really wanted a smaller sort of church with a more austere kind of environment. They really wanted to carry through the end of Catholicism fully. They also, in the same way that they had objected to the Pope as head of the church, they objected to the English monarch as head of the church for very good reason. The church was a spiritual institution, not a political one. And in place of control from the church at the top in this way, they wanted congregational control. That is, control by the people in the church. And this is where the term congregational comes from, as a description of many of these sorts of churches. Now, many Puritans remained as loyal members of the Church of England. They were simply unhappy there, but they were continually working within the Anglican Church to effect more change and bring about more change. And they were very frustrated. They really didn't get their way until into the next century when they really got more control of Parliament and so on. But there was another small group of Puritans who were so disaffiliated with the Anglican Church that they would have nothing to do with it. They thought it was virtually as corrupt as the Roman Catholic Church. They were radical, very extremist in their position, and so they separated. And they came to be known as separatists. The separatists were harassed and persecuted, and partly for opposing the Anglican Church, because after all, the Anglican Church was the officially recognized Church of England, and partly because they caused a good deal of trouble in their agitation. Now, this is where we finally come to Bradford's of Plymouth Plantation. The anthology selections really jump to chapter 9 in the anthology, leave out quite a big chunk at the beginning. Many other anthologies used in this course do include those chapters. What those chapters do is provide a background for William Bradford, and in so doing provide us with a background for the separatists in England. Bradford was born in, I think, 1588, and he was just a teenager, really, when he joined up with the separatists, and they were being so badly harassed that in 1609 they had to flee from England. Now, if we just come back here to this chart, when Elizabeth died, there was nobody to take over the throne. Each of these three monarchs before had no children, and so they had to go all the way back to Henry and out to his sister Margaret and down to Margaret's grandson, and that happened to be James VI of Scotland, who became James I of England. And it turned out that he was very, very powerfully in favor of the national church. And so while Elizabeth had let the religious tempest in England ride, James I began an active campaign of harassment against the separatists. Thus, 6 years into his reign in 1609, we get this group of separatists deciding to flee from England, and they flee to Holland. Holland is very receptive to Reformed churches. The Dutch Reformed Church is well established by now, and so they have a very congenial environment there. They lived first at Amsterdam and then at Leiden, and Bradford talks about that as a pretty positive experience, but after some years they got into some difficulty, particularly with their young people, who, as they were growing from childhood into their teenage years, didn't particularly get excited about the Puritan position. I mean, they simply couldn't relate to it because they'd grown up in Holland, and so they were much more lukewarm in their attitude towards religion. On top of that, they were not all marrying among their own. They were sometimes meeting Dutch adolescents, and romances started up. And so the separatists, a very small group really, saw the demise of their community coming very, very soon. And so in 1619, they heard about an expedition that was going to come out to the New World, and they appealed to James I. And again, if you look back at this chart, you'll see that James I was still on the throne from 1603 to 1625. When they appealed to him in 1619, he readily granted permission for them to go to the New World and set up a colony. His view of it was that they were English. This was an English colony, and he didn't particularly want to stamp them out. He just wanted to get rid of them someplace else. William Bradford himself began as a weaver. He read theology. He became very active in this separatist group, and they sailed late in the summer of 1620. And the selections in the anthology pick up with their journey across the Atlantic in chapter 9. Of Plymouth Plantation is a pretty good historical document, and you ought to see what a mighty tome it is. Here's an edition of it. This is a good inch and a half thick, 500 and so pages long, so it's a hefty work. Pretty good historical document. A lot of our information about the early situation at Plymouth comes from here. Some chapters left out recount the month that they spent at Massachusetts, or at least at Cape Cod. They landed at Provincetown on November the 11th, and it was just a month later, December the 11th, when they finally, an exploring party landed at Plymouth, and they decided that would be the place to go. In the meantime, they had made expeditions on Cape Cod, 2 expeditions in this area. They'd come down, they'd encountered Native Americans on December 8th and explored along this shore to reach this particular place. That is all. I provide that map to demonstrate how accurately we can reconstruct from Bradford's descriptions of exactly what happened. He's a very good historian in that sense. Now, an interesting document in connection with that is found in the anthology selections on page 251. This is the Mayflower Compact. We need to keep in mind that these pilgrims were really headed for someplace to the further south, into the Virginia area, and they ran into some difficulty with bad weather and so came back. Their charter did not authorize them to land here, and so they had to do something. And this is an interesting kind of document. We whose names are underwritten, the loyal subjects of our dread sovereign Lord King James, do by these present solemnly and mutually in the presence of God and one another covenant and combine ourselves together into a civil body politic. In case you're not familiar with this usage of words, this is what is called a performative use of words. Perhaps the most well-known example of this would be when a minister says, "I pronounce you man and wife." The act of speaking the words does the deed. The speaking and the deed are one and the same. The speaking of the words performs something. It brings something into existence. And as such, this is rather interesting because a reality does not exist before these words are spoken, but once these words are spoken, a new reality has been created. This is analogous to what literature does in creating a separate reality. And so there's various other kinds of uses of words besides literature which create a separate reality. And by virtue hereof to enact, constitute, and frame such just and equal laws, ordinances, acts, as shall be convenient for the general good of the colony, unto which we promise all due submission and obedience. Well, they made a late start in 1620, and so they landed late in the season. November, December is not the time to get started on a new colony. And so we get an account of the starving time, and this leads to a section on Indian relations. We make an interesting discovery. Two Native Americans appear. One is called Samoset and the other is Squanto, and we learned something there's all kinds of revelations in this work, things that our mythology has overlooked. Samoset speaks English, and Squanto has already been to England. These are Native Americans. and that deserves some explanation. Long before these settlers came and settled, Europeans were coming out and fishing off the coast of America and landing on the beaches to dry and salt their fishes before they sailed back. I mean, long before, for decades before. They may even have been doing this before Columbus's time. In any case, some Native Americans got to know them, and clearly these two had made enough contact, and one of them had actually gone back to England on a ship and been there probably for a season or two and then come back to America. The other presumably had picked up English by conversing over many seasons with fishermen on the coast. From there we move into some difficult times, troubles. We learn about Thomas Morton at Mount Wollaston, and it might be helpful if we have a look at what the major plantations here were. Here's Plymouth. Mount Wollaston is about 8 or 10 miles to the north, and it became known as Marymount. And Massachusetts Bay up here is the big settlement that comes in 1629. Earlier I mentioned Roger Williams getting in trouble and having to flee and set up a dissenters colony. That's down here at Providence, Rhode Island. These colonies are certainly four that figure very prominently in the readings. Thomas Morton was not a conformist. There was a lot of drinking. There was entertaining of the natives, selling guns and so on, and so Bradford expresses considerable displeasure about him. Then there is the problem that Bradford brings up about the dispersal of the people. He says, also the people of the plantation began to grow in their outward estates. As their livestock increase, and the increase vendible, that is, the increase of their stock is easily sold, there was no longer any holding them together, but now they must of necessity go to their great lots. Now, to understand what's being said here, here's a look at one of these colonies. This is Wethersfield in 1640. And the way these colonies were structured, people clustered on very small lots at the center, and here at the center is the meeting house, which functioned as a civil meeting house and a church. The land was stretched out in tracts all around. When people went to work on their land, they had to walk out to their land. And you could see the mileage here. They'd have to walk a mile or two out to their land and then walk back or ride a wagon out and to work their land. But they didn't live on their land. They lived in this central area. But that rapidly changed. Here's an example of Andover in 1661. This is where all the houses are located. Actually, there are only three houses dispersed from that center. But notice that just 17 years later, people have decided that it's too inconvenient to walk out to their land, and so now all these other houses have been built on these farms. This is a major shift from what's called a clustered village to a dispersed village. Now, Bradford was particularly concerned about this in religious terms, as he says here, by which means they were scattered all over the bay quickly, and the town in which they lived compactly till now was left very thin and almost desolate. I fear this will be the ruin of New England, at least of the churches of God there, and will provoke the Lord's displeasure against them. It's an interesting view that this would actually severely damage the church. And in fact, it It did. Of course, the Puritan position was a rigorous control over people. They liked people to be right there around the meeting house. They liked to sort of monitor people, make sure they were all in church. And once people moved out to a mile or two or three distant, they stopped coming to the church. And that really was the beginning of this lack of loyalty to the church. A third kind of difficulty that arose was with the Native Americans, and we have a section called the Pequot War, which starts on page 259. If you read the footnote on that page, you'll see that there's been some back and forth violence, that there's been escalating violence going on for some time. Finally, the Puritans go out there and massacre 400 Pequot and put an end to it. Then we get a real bad example of what Bradford calls wickedness breaking out, sundry notorious sins. This section really does reveal the Puritan emphasis on upright moral behavior and compliance with the law. There appears to be real sexual laxity going on here, extramarital sex and premarital sex and sodomy and all kinds of things. And of course, this is seen by the Puritans as leading to the downfall of society. Of course, there were executions that came out of this sort of thing. Our excerpts don't go into those executions, but Bradford, as governor, certainly had to authorize those, and so he is a witness to the history at Plymouth. Now, Bradford's book is also highly Protestant and biblical. The emphasis where the Roman Catholic Church got its authority from the church itself, from the hierarchy of the church. The Protestants went directly to the Bible, sidestepping the church. And so we have to understand this religious biblical background. In the Bible, as you know, God is anthropomorphic, which is to say he's drawn very much in man's image, as are the gods in most of the religions in the early scriptures. A being who relates personally, who has human emotions like anger and mercy and justice and love. Now, it is true that in the Middle Ages an abstract theological, philosophical language grew up around the deity, but this was regarded by the Protestants as very much a Roman Catholic invention, and so they didn't pay a lot of attention to it. They went right back to that very anthropomorphic language of the Bible. Now, let's review some things we looked at earlier in connection with the Native Americans. I talked about three uses for words: labeling use of words, when words are used as labels for things present. An example would be, look at this book, Bradford's History of Plymouth. I've got a book here present in my hand. Secondly, a referential use of words, words referring to things or events not present. Yesterday I read a book on Puritan New England. And thirdly, the imaginative use of words, words which refer to a separate reality or create a separate reality. Yesterday, Susie borrowed the book Puritan Ideas. Well, I invented Susie, and I invented the title Puritan Ideas. So this is clearly a separate verbal reality. This is a fiction. Now, to again review some where this goes, there's a progress by which belief then develops. First, number 4 here, imaginative words are seen as referential, which means a separate reality is seen as real, factual, or truly existing, and where it exists, it exists either elsewhere or it exists here invisibly. And then an entire culture adopts the same separate reality as real, factual, or true. And the result is a mythology, which consists of mythic beings and actions, or mythic beings and events in an imaginative space and time. This is review. Now, when we apply this to the Bible, you see, we have a referential reality lying at the historical core. The stories of Moses and Jesus, of course, are not based on made-up people. Something's back there. But the stories of Moses are passed down orally for 250 years. The stories of Jesus were passed down for 30 or 40 years after his death, before the first gospel was written. And so the original referential reality has been reshaped in an imaginative form, and to it has then been grafted a separate reality that comes from the oral transmission process and from an inherited symbolic system. And of course, for the believer in the Bible, and this would certainly include the Puritans, these 4 points, again on the screen, these 4 points apply absolutely. The imaginative words by which the stories, let's say, of Moses in the Old Testament and Jesus in the New, the imaginative layering is seen as referential. The believer doesn't make any separation between the literary accompaniment of these and the events themselves. The separate reality that is evoked in the Bible is seen as real, factual, and truly existing. And the whole culture has adopted this, and so you have a mythology that lies alongside the real world and is accepted as just as real. Now, the Protestants did tend to strip away some aspects of this mythology when they rebelled against the Roman Catholic Church. They stripped away purgatory, for instance, because it really wasn't biblically based. They stripped away the saints because that was something that had developed within the Roman Catholic Church. They used the word saints to apply to themselves. And they stripped away a lot of extraordinary powers that had been attached to church officials. The power, for instance, to turn the bread and the wine into the body and blood of Jesus at the Mass, for instance. They got rid of a lot of those. But certain things they kept, and we need to look at one example of what they kept. Satan. Satan in the Old Testament is simply a small letter word meaning accuser in most references. In the book of Job, it acquires a capital letter and Satan becomes a being in the court of God. He's an accuser who makes a lot of trouble for Job. Then in the book of Revelation, he is kicked out of heaven and he becomes a fallen angel. And now he begins a career of true evil. But if you think that the mythology of Satan ended with the closing of the Bible, well, think again. Here, for instance, is the way Bradford begins of Plymouth Plantation. Now, let's look at these words here. The gross darkness of popery which had covered and overspread the Christian world. There is Bradford and the Puritans' view of the first 1,500 years of Christian history. Gross darkness of popery which had covered and overspread the Christian world. Now, let's look at these words up here. The first breaking out of the light of the gospel in our honorable nation of England, which was the first of nations whom the Lord adorned. That's what Bradford and the Puritans believed. They believed that because of this darkness of popery covering the whole world, that the gospel had not been heard anywhere in 1,500 years, and that England was the first nation where it truly was heard. Now, from a realistic historical point of view, that's highly ironic when we consider how the Reformation came about in England. But this gives you a good idea of the kind of mythology that developed around these people. What he is saying here is that Satan has been responsible for the Roman Catholic Church. The Roman Catholic Church is Satan's work. What wars and oppositions ever since Satan hath raised, maintained, and continued against the saints from time to time in one sort or another. So Satan has really been a troublemaker in this Puritan community. How? Sometimes by bloody death and cruel torments. Other whiles imprisonments, banishments, and other hard usages, as being loath his kingdom to go down. I think that what those words mean is because Satan was, number one, reluctant to let his kingdom collapse, number two, to let the truth prevail, and number three, to let the churches of God revert to their ancient purity and recover their primitive order, liberty, and beauty. Satan has had a 15-year successful plan at subverting the truth. I mean, what a great way to subvert Christianity, to allow it to get into a wrong-headed sort of way, which the Roman Catholic Church was. And Satan was quite happy with that. But now we get it breaking out of the truth with these Puritans, and Satan is not too happy. But when he, that is Satan, could not prevail by these means against the main truths of the gospel, but that these truths began to take rooting in many places, being watered with the blood of martyrs and blessed from heaven with a gracious increase, he, Satan, then began to take him to his ancient stratagems used of old against the first Christians, when by the bloody and barbarous persecutions of the heathen emperors he could not stop and subvert the course of gospel, but that it speedily overspread with a wonderful celerity the then best known parts of the world, he then began to sow errors, heresies, and wonderful dissensions among the professors, which means the believers, those who profess the religion themselves, working upon their pride and ambition with other corrupt passions incident to all mortal men, yea, to the saints themselves, by which woeful effects followed. So incorrect doctrine, errors in religion, heresies, and dissensions within the church are all the work of Satan. And not only bitter contentions and heartburnings, schisms with other horrible confusions, but Satan took occasion and advantage thereby to foist in a number of vile ceremonies, with many unprofitable canons and decrees, which have since been as snares to many poor and peaceable souls, even to this day. So many, therefore, of these professors, that is, these believers, as saw the evil of these things in these parts, and whose hearts the Lord had touched with heavenly zeal for his truth, they shook off this yoke of anti-Christian bondage. And as the Lord's free people joined themselves by a covenant of the Lord into a church estate, in the fellowship of the gospel, to walk in all his ways made known, or to be made known unto them according to their best endeavors, whatsoever it should cost them, the Lord assisting them. And of course, in that section, he is referring very, very specifically to his own group, the Puritans in England. And what it cost them, something this ensuing history will declare. So that overlay of mythology, of Satan opposing them, creates this, what is quite an accurately done history, into a Christian history in which they are supported by God and doing God's work, and they are opposed by Satan, who would like to have the whole thing stopped. Now, there are various passages through this where you see him interpreting events in these terms, where something good happens. Bradford repeatedly describes this in terms of God's providence. There's this example which occurs very, very early. Now, I've added italics here to emphasize this. This incident occurs very early in the passages. And may I not omit here, this is on the boat, a special work of God's providence. There was a proud and very profane young man condemning the poor people in their sickness and cursing them daily, saying he hoped to cast half of them overboard before half their journey's end. But it pleased God, before they came half seas over, to smite this young man with a grievous disease, of which he died in a desperate manner, and so was himself the first that was thrown overboard. Notice the ethnocentric, the self-centered aspect of the way God's providence is meted out. Here's another example. They're at Cape Cod. They try to sail south to Virginia, but they're driven back by shoals. But after they had sailed that course about half the day, they fell amongst dangerous shoals and roaring breakers, and they were so far entangled as they conceived themselves in great danger, and the wind shrinking, they resolved to bear up again for the Cape, that is, to turn around and go north, and thought themselves happy to get out of these dangers before night overtook them, as by God's good providence they did. Essentially, whenever something good happens for them, it is God's providence. And the same thing occurs when they kill the Pequot Indians. This is God working with them. You'll notice, though, when something really bad happens to them, that there's no mention of God's providence. It's a very convenient sort of explanation, but you see, that's the way mythology works. It's very personally oriented. It's very social group oriented. It's ethnocentric or culture centered. The deity is seen as having an interest only in the individual culture that he is serving. He's not seen as having an interest in anybody else. So other people become the pawns or the victims of violence, but that's all serving the providence for the group who holds these beliefs. As an example, from the starving time, we have this passage, but that which was most sad and lamentable was that in 2 or 3 months' time, half of their company died, especially in January and February 1621. This is just a month or so after they land. Being the depth of winter and wanting houses and other comforts, being infected with scurvy and other diseases which this long voyage and their condition had wrought upon them, so as there died sometimes 2 or 3 a day in the foresaid time, so that of 100 and odd persons scarcely 50 remained. But there's no explanation for that. However, there is something good, some place where God must be working here, and that comes up in the immediately following passage, where he says, of these, in the time of most distress, there was but 6 or 7, that is, of the 50 who survived, there was but 6 or 7 sound persons who, with abundance of toil and hazard of their own health, fetched them wood, made them fires, clothed and unclothed them, a rare example and worthy to be remembered. Bradford was one of the 6, so he can say, we were much beholden in our low and sick condition. Well, these 6 or 7 didn't get sick, so that's God's providence. And yet the Lord so upheld these persons in this general calamity that they were not at all infected either with sickness or lameness. So you can see that God's providence as an explanation is rather selectively used, and that, of course, is the way a mythology works. Well, there's the charter issued to the Massachusetts Bay, people. It still exists in a museum. And here we come to the huge migration of 1629, where a large number of Puritans came out, and John Winthrop was among the early ones. This is an immense migration. In the next 10 years, more than 10,000 came out, and there were even some Anglicans, Presbyterians, and Quakers mixed in. There were too many for one settlement, and so settlements started to proliferate all over the colonies. If you think about the way those clustered settlements worked, and people could only walk a couple of miles out to their fields, once you got a couple of hundred people, the community got too large to be manageable, and so people either went off and created a new colony, or they started to move out onto the land, and you get those dispersed settlements. John Winthrop's A Model of Christian Charity was a sermon that he preached on board ship with an early group of these Puritans before they landed. And I want to draw your attention to the central passage from the Model of Christian Charity, because it really does have a great deal to do with the forming of a vision for America. We must, he says to these people, and incidentally this is after a long sermon in which he has talked about all of us believers being members of the body of Christ, another piece of symbolism that is very highly biblical. We must be knit together in this work as one man. We must entertain each other in brotherly affection. We must be willing to abridge ourselves of our superfluities for the supply of others' necessities. We must uphold our community as members of the same body. There's the same, that's an analogy or a simile here, as members of the same body. We must be part of a body in the same way that hands, feet, arms, legs, eyes, and head are part of a living body. So shall we keep the unity of the Spirit in the bond of peace. The Lord will be our God and delight to dwell among us, his own people, and will command a blessing upon us in all our ways, so that we shall see much more of his wisdom, power, goodness, and truth than formerly we have been acquainted with. We shall find that God, the God of Israel, is among us, when 10 of us shall be able to resist 1,000 of our enemies, when he shall make us a praise and glory, that men shall say of succeeding plantations, the Lord make it like that of New England. For we must consider that we shall be as a city upon a hill. The eyes of all people are upon us, so that if we shall deal falsely with our God, we shall open the mouths of enemies to speak evil of the ways of God. There is now set before us life and good, death and evil. We are commanded this day to love the Lord our God and to walk in his ways. A very, very central passage in this Puritan literature, particularly that image of the city on a hill. And I think it's reasonable to say that even where in the contemporary world Americans may not believe in the biblical framework of this particular literature, they still, I think of America very much as a city on a hill. That image very much survives, and into our own time. Now, John Winthrop is a very interesting man. He then goes on to become the governor for a good many of the early years of the Massachusetts Bay colony. So in Bradford's history, and then in John Winthrop, we are getting the literature of two governors of these two first colonies. Winthrop's main writing is his journal, and we'll be looking at that, coming to that in another class or two. And he did write other things of considerable importance. He wrote a very important spiritual autobiography, which is in the text, but which I haven't included on the syllabus. It comes after the journal. I think it does. Now, in order to see how this vision, Puritan vision of America actually lasted and persisted, we need to look at another very, very interesting figure, and that is Cotton Mather. Now, in going to Cotton Mather, we are indeed we are moving to quite a later period in this Puritan history, and I think it's worth noting that the Puritan cause did not do all that well. It started out with, as you can see, very, very high ideals and a very strict moral position, a determination, a powerful determination to build commonwealths here which would be moral and upright, founded upon biblical law, that would be free of dissension, that would be pure, and the purity that they desired to have in religion, purity from Catholic doctrine and the excesses that they perceived in Roman Catholic religion, that pure ideal of purity leaked over into all other areas of life. They attempted to live purely and simply, and they are thus regarded as probably the most morally upright group of people that have ever come to America. And that's probably true. They had, of course, they had their difficulties, but they certainly made an effort. And of course, their attempt to live a very morally pure and ethically correct life is what has given the word puritanical to our vocabulary. Incidentally, it's worth pointing out here too that while the Puritan is a strictly applies to these groups that came out to Massachusetts Bay and then to Connecticut and Rhode Island and so on and settled in huge numbers, there was a Puritan strain that ran through various other Protestant groups. The Anglican Church certainly had groups of Puritans who wanted to preserve the Anglican Church in the form that they had, but they wanted to purify it, but not in such a radical way as the Massachusetts Bay Puritans. The Presbyterian Church in Scotland had a very strong Puritan streak, and certain other Protestant groups too were very Puritan. The Quakers have, in a sense, a Puritan streak. So we have to recognize that the term Puritan with a capital P has a very specific reference, on the one hand, to a group of disaffiliated Anglicans, well, first of all, separatists that came to Plymouth, and then Anglicans who were not happy with the Anglican Church, but not really willing to throw it over, and so they were bringing out a kind of purified Anglicanism to Massachusetts Bay. But Puritan also has the more general sense of a sort of way of living that did permeate through many other denominations. It had its difficulties, the dispersal of the settlements, the increasing wealth too in the colonies had a lot to do with the decline of Puritanism, and we can talk about that in later classes. To come now to Cotton Mather. Cotton Mather wrote an immense work, Magnalia Christi Americana translates as the mighty works of Christ in America. It dates to 1702. We can get a sense of what Mather was trying to do if we take the first couple of lines of Virgil's Aeneid, written in 19 BC, Arma virumque cano Troiae qui primus ab oris, one of the most famous lines in all of classical literature. I sing of arms on a man who first fled from Troy to Italy's shores. And then Virgil goes on in an invocation to the Muses for inspiration. This is the national epic of Rome. Mather's Magnalia Christi Americana begins, I write the wonders of the Christian religion, flying from the deprivations of Europe to the American strand, and assisted by the holy author of that religion. The national epic has this pattern, and these are not the only two. There's the Lusiads, Camoens, the Lusiads, for instance, the great Portuguese national epic, which talks about the conquest of India. I discovered one of the few copies when I was living in Southeast Asia of another such national epic, the Conquest of Malacca, written in Portuguese, only once done in a translation with very limited circulation. Many of these epics died. There is also one in the textbook in poetry, the Conquest of New Mexico, and it begins the very same way. For reference purposes, if you look up on page 163, you'll see de Velagra, the history of New Mexico. It begins, I sing of arms and the heroic man, the being, courage, care, and high emprise of him whose unconquered patience, etc., etc. So you see that national epics all model themselves after Virgil's. Well, this immense 1,200-page work by Cotton Mather is a prose epic with an Aeneid-like beginning, an invocation to the Muses, with all kinds of traditions drawn from earlier national epics. It's also a history of what has gone on in America, and he draws on all previous historical works. Bradford's Plymouth Plantation, for instance. He also draws on oral stories from more recent times that have not yet been written down. In addition, it has been called a Jeremiad, Jeremiad. That particular term is based on the Old Testament book of Jeremiah. And if you have any familiarity with that book, you'll know that Jeremiah was one of the most fiery of all the prophets. He was the one who came down in 587 BC upon the people of Jerusalem, which had just been destroyed by the Babylonians, and said, well, I told you so. And he had, in fact, for 25 years, he was saying, if you don't, people don't smarten up and become upright before your God, this is going to happen to you too. The Magnalia Christi Americana is also full of biographies of William Bradford and John Eliot and so on. They're all, of course, translated into Christian terms, and they become stories of great saints. In other words, biography becomes what is known as hagiography. It's an immense work. So we have with these writers a unified vision. It's Protestant, it's therefore very biblical. It's a vision of pilgrims and Puritans as a chosen people. It's a reenactment of the exodus of Moses from slavery. It's an emergence of a new nation, a promised land, populated by pure-hearted people, despite all the efforts of Satan to retard and destroy it. It is a vision that evoked a separate reality where God's providence was primary, where Satan's malicious evil opposes them, and where they are all one in what we could call the body of Christ. That still that city of the image, city on the hill image persists even in what is now rapidly becoming a secular age, and continues to inspire Americans and with their own purpose, and to capture a kind of essence of America for others who would like to come here. Well, have a good day.